Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and today we're going to be talking about how Europe has fallen behind America and the gap is growing. They were actually at really parity with the United States back in the early 2000s, but by this point, they're not really even close. And this is important because this helps to indicate how does the United States treat its allies? Does it help to foster their growth, or does it sabotage them? Does it cannibalize them in order to benefit itself, such as with the Nord Stream pipeline bombing? So let's see. And this is in Financial Times. The Ukraine war has revived the transatlantic alliance. Okay, so I can agree with that it was really dying out and that the Ukraine war did galvanize it to a certain extent, but it galvanized it while at the same time weakening Europe. But the relationship between the United States and its European allies is increasingly lopsided. The US economy is now considerably richer and more dynamic than the EU or Britain, and the gap is growing. That will have an impact well beyond relative living standards. Europe's dependence on the United States for technology, energy, capital, and military protection is steadily undermining any aspirations that you might have for strategic autonomy. So autonomy is a big deal in modern times. And if you're not autonomous, you need to at least make sure that the group or people that you're subservient to are treating you well. And I've challenged people in my comment section, because I have a lot of haters, to give me some names of countries that have benefited from being under the thumb of the United States, and people just can't. Really, the closest example that I can think of is probably South Korea. But again, South Korea is one of those countries where the United States needs them to be strong to counter North Korea. If it wasn't for that, because the United States doesn't want to go to direct war with North Korea, if it wasn't for that, I really sincerely doubt that South Korea would be doing as well as it is. And South Korea is actually declining due to the kind of decline of their culture. And so it's anyone's guess about why a country would ever want to join the West at this point. You saw countries in the Balkans region of Europe, and they joined the kind of Western sphere of influence, and then they became even more heavily in debt. So you really got to ask yourselves, who's benefiting from joining the United States? Not even the American people are benefiting from the United States at this point. So I really don't get it. I don't get why people opt into the oligarchs that run America. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's not objectively in anyone's best interest aside from those oligarchs. So please, I'm still asking the same question. Let me know in the comment section if you know countries that have benefited from the United States, directly benefited from them, not just like been related to them in some way, shape, or form, and they did well in the recent decades. Okay, so the US economy is now considerably richer and more dynamic than the EU or Britain. The gap is growing. That will have an impact beyond relative living standards. Europe's dependence on US. Okay, so we talked about that. Strategic autonomy. In 2008, the EU and the US economies were roughly the same size. But since the global financial crisis, their economic fortunes have dramatically diverged. As Jeremy Shapiro and Jana Pugliarin of the European Council of Foreign Relations points out, in 2008, the EU's economy was somewhat larger than America's, 16.2 trillion versus 14.7 trillion. By 2022, the US economy had grown to 25 trillion, whereas the EU and the UK together had only 19.8 trillion. So barely any growth for them, whereas a near doubling for the United States. America's economy is now nearly one-third bigger. It is more than 50% larger than the EU without the UK. The aggregate figures are shocking. Underpinning them is a picture of a Europe that has fallen behind sector by sector. So this should tell you, why would you want to join the European Union, and why would you want to join NATO, and why would you want to be subservient to the West in any way, shape, or form? The European technology landscape is dominated by US firms such as Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. So I've talked about this before, where Europe trains the people so that they're highly competent, and then they end up going to work for America, which is not a good state you want to be in as a nation. The 7 largest tech firms in the world by market capitalization are all American. And I think that's going to change when the various mechanisms behind market capitalization ends up realizing that America is in steep decline and China is rising. I think that's going to change to China. That's going to be a pivot to China. There are only two European companies in the top 20, ASML and SAP. I don't know much about SAP, but ASML is a major business in terms of semiconductors, and China is trying to make them obsolete due to the fact that ASML is going along with American sanctions against China. European champions are often acquired by American companies. Okay, so the free market, if you have good ideas, they're just going to buy you up. Skype was bought by Microsoft in 2011. DeepMind was bought by Google in 2014. The development of AI is also likely to be dominated by American and Chinese firms. That's the thing. China doesn't allow that. They say that the firms are owned by China. The good ideas that China created, they're owned by China. And so the Chinese government actually takes care of its big business, whereas the United States, sure, they take care of their big business, but then they don't allow their allies to take care of their own big businesses. So Europe is subservient to the United States. And so whenever their big businesses get crushed by American big businesses, they're not allowed to retaliate, or they're not allowed to protect their own interests. The leading universities that feed the pipeline of tech startups in the US are lacking in the EU. The Shanghai and the higher education a magazine, I think it's higher education something, that's what THE stands for, rankings of the world's top universities both have only one EU institution in the top 30. Britain does better courtesy of Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial, and others. In 1990, Europe made 44% of the world's semiconductors. Wow, I didn't realize it was that high. That figure is now 9% compared with 12% for America. Both EU and the US are rushing to build up their capabilities. But while the US is expected to see 14 new semiconductor plants come on stream by 2025, I don't think that's actually going to happen. Taiwanese companies are having a hard time between American regulations and America not having the technical know-how to actually work at these semiconductor plants. It's just been very difficult for Taiwanese companies to actually come here and start up plants. And whenever they try to bring in their own workers don't want to come here because don't want to come to America because America sucks. I keep saying here, but I'm not actually an American anymore because I moved out of the country. But Taiwanese workers don't want to move to America, and American workers don't want Taiwanese workers there. So there's just so many potential barriers to semiconductor industries in America that I really don't think it's going to happen, or if it does happen, it's going to be significantly slowed by the compared to what they were hoping, what their estimates were of the timeline. Europe and the Middle East will add just 10 new semiconductor plants compared with 43 new facilities in China and Taiwan. Wow. But the United States and EU are looking to turn this situation around with ambitious industrial policies that provide public finance and incentives for chip manufacturers and producers of electric vehicles. Okay, but China is dominating in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of solar panels, all of that stuff. But the dollar status as the world's reserve currency gives the Americans the ability to finance their ambitions without spooking the markets. So again, the United States is using its control of the global trade and reserve currency status to cannibalize their own allies, the Europeans. As one European industrialist puts it, they can just swipe the credit card. The EU, by contrast, has a much smaller budget and has only just begun issuing common debt. Private capital is also much more readily available in the United States. Paul Achleitner, the chair of the Global Advisory Board at Deutsche Bank, says that Europe is now almost totally dependent on the US capital markets. So they're completely beholden on the United States, and the United States is just not good to its allies. He tells me that Europe has very few of the large pension funds that give depth to the United States capital markets, adding that if you want to get anything sizable done, whether it is an acquisition or an IPO, you always go back to American investors. The European Union has spoken a lot about creating a capital markets union to give Europe some of the scale of the US, but progress has been feeble. Unlike Europe, the United States also has plentiful and cheap domestic supplies of energy. The shale revolution means that America is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. Meanwhile, energy prices in Europe have soared. That's embarrassing and tragic because the United States has made this problem for Europe, where Europe cannot get gas and get energy from Russia. And the United States, despite being the largest producer of oil and gas, they actually have the lowest strategic petroleum reserves in history, and they can't refill it because the prices are too high. So just complete incompetence by really all Western leaders at this point. Meanwhile, energy prices in Europe have soared. The Ukraine war and the loss of cheap Russian gas means that European industry typically pays 3 or 4 times as much for energy as their American competitors. So America could fix that. America could just give energy more cheaply to Europe, but they're not doing that. So again, I ask you, what are the benefits of being subservient to America? Gloomy European bosses say this is already leading to factory closures in Europe. Some in Britain may be tempted to see all this as proof that inside the EU, Britain was shackled to a corpse and that Brexit was a good move. But outside the European single market, Britain suffers from an exaggerated version of the problems at scale that are hobbling the EU itself. British industry is already falling behind as a result. So are there really no areas where Europe is a world leader? Some point proudly to the fact that about the size of the EU single market means that companies all over the world have had to adopt European regulation, the so-called Brussels effect, but it would clearly be better to lead the world in creating wealth rather than regulating it. So that's actually very true. China is trying to be a competitor in terms of creating the standards and regulations and norms for various technologies and industries. But Europe is doing a decent job. The European Union is doing a decent job of doing that as well, creating regulations. But again, as they say there, it'd be better to create wealth instead of regulate it. I mean, if you could do both, that's excellent. That's what China's doing. But if you can't, you'd rather create wealth instead of being the one that regulates it. And they're just not creating wealth. The United States pillages it even from their own allies. Europe does outperform in lifestyle industries. Almost 2/3 of the world's tourist arrivals are into Europe. The luxury goods market is dominated by European companies. Football, the world's most popular sport, that's soccer for any Americans listening, is dominated by European teams, although many of the biggest clubs are now owned by Middle Eastern, American, or Asian investors. So just embarrassing all around. Europe doesn't own anything. Even if they do have good products and services, it's actually owned by non-Europeans. And China just won't allow that. Europe's dominance on lifestyle industries underlines that life in the old continent is still attractive for many, but perhaps that is part of the problem. Without a greater sense of threat, Europe may never summon the will to reverse its inexorable decline in power, influence, and wealth. I don't know about that last paragraph because they do have a sense of threat. I mean, they're declining pretty rapidly under the thumb of America. They're afraid of Russia. They're getting dominated in various industries by China. I mean, they have a sense of threat. They just can't really do anything while still under the thumb of America. So that is our article from the Financial Times on how Europe has fallen behind America and the gap is growing. Thank you for watching. Please give us a thumbs up. It helps us in the algorithm. Please subscribe to our channel for more content. And please leave a comment in the comment box with any questions, concerns, and critiques. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.